Okay, so we're going to start off with an intro to metabolism. We're going to break this up into 3 parts. This first part we're going to go over will cover energy. Alright, so let's start with metabolism. Metabolism is a combination of interactions between molecules in a cell. So you're going to have interactions where you're making molecules or breaking them down. In this diagram we have a metabolic pathway, we have a starting molecule, we've got several enzymes occurring, we've got reactions, intermediate steps, and products made, and then we have our final product. Alright, when you talk about metabolism, you talk about 2 types. The first type we'll talk about is anabolic, which is basically going to be the consuming of energy to build complex molecules. So kind of thinking about putting smaller pieces together to make something bigger. Next we have catabolic, which is going to be the release of energy by breaking down those complex molecules. So anabolic, you're building complex molecules. Catabolic, we are breaking them down. In this picture right here, it shows us the different types of energy, just as an example of swimmers and divers on this lake. So you've got a diver who has potential energy on the platform that is more than those in the water. You have potential energy converting to kinetic energy. Okay, once that diver gets into the water, that diver has less potential energy in the water than on the person on the platform. And then climbing up converts the kinetic energy of muscle movement to potential energy, so starting that process over again. So if you look, energy is used, kind of goes to a plateau, and then you build up the energy again until you've got that potential energy built up again. Okay, and just some basic forms of energy. We've got kinetic energy, we've got thermal energy, which is heat energy, potential energy, and chemical energy. Okay, when you have potential energy, it's being released when you're in a chemical reaction. So chemical reactions will release potential energy. You have kinetic energies, typically going to be associated with movement. Heat is associated with random movement, and potential energy here is what matter possesses. So all matter will possess some kind of potential energy. Okay, when you talk about energy, you're basically talking about systems. All right, so when you talk about a system, it could be anything from a cell to an ecosystem, whatever the case may be. When you talk about thermodynamics, you're talking about the study of energy transformation within a system, between systems. All right, we have 2 types. We're going to look at isolated systems, which is not necessarily going to always be what occurs in nature, but those are typically going to be isolated from their surroundings. Think like a thermos cup where it keeps inside internally those items warm, where on the outside it could be freezing. Then we have open systems, which are going to contain energy and matter that are transferred between system and surroundings. So, for instance, and we'll talk about it later, but cells would be an example of an open system. So when you talk about thermodynamics, there's 2 laws. The first law of thermodynamics is that energy can be transferred and transformed, but it cannot be created or destroyed. So kind of the overall overarching principle law of any discipline of science, also known as the principle of conservation of energy. Basically, you can't destroy energy, you can't create it. It's always being transferred or transformed into other uses. So in this example, we've got our little bear, and he is going to be eating fish. And the fish right here, as he's eating them, he's actually eating energy that they contained in the form of chemical energy, which is then going to be transferred to his system, his body, in the form of energy that his body can use, that his cells can use. Once the bear dies, then his energy will be transferred back into the ecosystem. Alright, the second law of thermodynamics is basically that some energy is unusable, so it gets lost as heat. And we say lost, not as in, oh, I can't find it, it's disappeared, but lost as in it's now unusable by organisms. It's now transferred into the atmosphere as heat energy. So when you have the bear, in our example again, he's consuming the oxygen, exhaling that carbon dioxide and water, but then that heat is being lost as he is, as you can see, running in this example. So some keywords you're going to need to know are two of words associated the most with free energy, which is the next topic. So you got spontaneous reactions. Okay. Spontaneous reactions are going to be the reactions that occur without any energy input. So it does not need energy to occur. They happen spontaneously. Okay. Then the other thing we're going to talk about is entropy. Entropy, it basically means disorder. So typically cells and organisms will replace more ordered forms with less ordered forms. And that's just kind of how the world works when it comes to the energy that's out in the universe. Okay, so I mentioned free energy. So free energy, or also known as Gibbs free energy, was described by Willard Gibbs, and basically what it helps scientists understand is what reactions will occur spontaneously and which need energy input. And that's very important because then we can measure and monitor reactions and also understand how that energy gets transformed into other energy used by the cell. Okay, so when you have the free energy change, so basically you're going to look at energy that can do work when temperature and pressure are uniform in a cell. So this is actually going to come into the form of an equation. So you've got the change in free energy, which is going to then be related to the change in enthalpy, or the change in total energy, which is delta H. Okay, and that's going to result in the change from entropy and temperature, so that's delta S, it's T delta S, so we've got delta G equals delta H minus temperature delta S. And so when you have the equation delta G equals delta H minus temperature delta S, you're going to be looking at this delta G. If the delta G is negative, that means that the reaction is spontaneous. Okay? And spontaneous reactions are kind of what we want. They're going to be the processes that can harness energy to perform the work. So what you have here is 3 examples of this change in free energy. So when you start off, you are going to have this scenario where you have more free energy. It's less stable, but there's a greater work capacity. So if we go back to our definitions on potential energy, this is basically where all that potential energy gets stored. All right, so let's pay attention to this example because it is a biology example, which really will help us later when we learn about diffusion and osmosis and all that. So something happens. A spontaneous change occurs. The free energy of the system decreases, so it becomes less than 0, so it becomes that negative number that we're looking for. The system becomes more stable, and the released energy can be harnessed to do work. So you can use that to harness the energy. So for instance, in this diffusion scenario, we are moving, looks like, from a higher concentration to low, and so in that movement we've actually created some energy that can be used within the cell for other purposes. Okay, once you get down to this final step, you've got less energy, so a lower G, you're more stable, and you have less work capacity. Next, you've got this graph which shows us an exergonic reaction when the energy is released and it's spontaneous. So you're going to have all this free energy being built up, has a high potential energy. Okay, you're going to have a reaction, that energy is going to leave the system. You're going to have products, that energy goes down. So the amount of energy that's released is actually going to result in a negative delta G, which again is showing us that there's going to be more work, that is more energy rather, that can be harnessed. Now you look on the other side with a non-spontaneous reaction, you're going to have the reactants starting at a low free energy. You're going to input energy into the system, and then that's going to give you a higher output, but the amount of energy that had to go in is going to be greater than 0, so that delta G will end up being a positive number. So again, non-spontaneous, we're positive delta G. Spontaneous is a negative delta G. And just as our final example, we have just non-biology examples of isolated systems and non-isolated systems. So this just shows you an isolated system that's occurring and stops once it reaches equilibrium. As you can see right here, the water level is equal. But when you have an open system, there's not really going to be equilibrium And if there is, not for very long, because as you can see down here in these different steps, it's going to continue to harness energy, release it, harness, release, harness, release. And that's kind of how you can look at cells and the body of organisms as being.